Good evening, everybody. It's Josh here with Big Slick Adventures, and hope everyone's doing well tonight. I decided to do something different, start a new series of videos. That, of course, being this is episode one of the I Have Such Sights to Show You. And this is going to be a series of basically Hellraiser related videos, and one of the reasons I decided to do this is wanted to do some extra content for the channel. And as most of you know who've been watching the channel for a while, know that I'm a big Hellraiser fan. And I looked around and there's plenty of other YouTube channels I watch, and some of them like focus a lot on, say, the Halloween franchise. But there isn't really a whole lot as far as Hellraiser material, so I thought maybe that's a void I could get into. I know from whatever it was, I think it was last October when we did on the Horror Hangouts, we did a whole Hellraiser franchise discussion, and that one really did well. In fact, got more views and likes than we did on our Halloween franchise discussion, which led me to think that maybe there's so many Halloween material out there. Maybe I should do like a separate video once a month, just kind of talking about different aspects of Hellraiser and the franchise as a whole. So that's what we're going to do tonight. I'm still kind of like figuring out what the best night to do. I decided to go ahead and just do it on a Thursday night. I'll be doing most of these. I'll be doing these like solo and seeing how those work. So I'm kind of like getting out of my comfort zone, though I have done a couple solo videos before, and those seem to work out okay, I think. So, hey, we got one person in the chat, or we had one person in the chat and they dropped out. Saw my ugly mug and they left, so that's okay. but so anyway, I figure for this first episode, I would kind of like talk about what my favorite things are of the Hellraiser franchise as a whole. And obviously, the franchise, I will admit, it's my favorite. It's got shares of peaks and valleys. Um, I say that it's my favorite based on the movies I actually consider to be Hellraiser films, which altogether is probably about six altogether. That's the first four and probably the last two. I would say Hellraiser Judgment certainly feels like a Hellraiser movie, and obviously the 2022 reboot. So I'm gonna, but still, I'm going to include all the other movies in there as I'm discussing this. So, but I think one of my favorite things about the Hellraiser franchise is the fandom. I think we are, as far as the Hellraiser fans go, the diehard fans, we're a very passionate group. We're a much smaller group than, say, your Halloween or Friday the 13th fan groups. And, but we're also extremely knowledgeable about our franchise and fairly protective of it because, it's like we're kind of like the underdogs a little bit. And because we are smaller, we don't attract as much, I don't know, as far as like, I don't know if I want to use the term toxic fans, but some of your bigger franchises will get a lot of people who just want to start keyboard wars, for example, if they don't like your opinion on a particular movie. You don't really have that in the Hellraiser fan group. Um, to use kind of like an analogy, if Halloween and Friday the 13th, for example, and I'm using an analogy in regards to 70s hard rock metal bands. If Halloween, Friday the 13th are Led Zeppelin and Black Sabbath, Hellraiser fans were kind of like Rush, which happens to be my favorite rock band as well, just because we're a much smaller base. We're more of a cult following, so to speak. Um, but we're definitely diehard fans, and it wasn't, of course, until much later in their career that Rush started getting noticed a lot more and recognized as they eventually got in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. So that's one way to equate it. So, one of the few groups on Facebook that actually follow is like a Hellraiser group, the Hellbound web, as it's called, and it's a great community. So I think that's the first thing I really like about the Hellraiser is basically the fandom for the most part. And as I go on later on, I may mention a few things that maybe I don't like so much about the Hellraiser franchise, to be fair, and it's a few things. Um, but going on next to another thing that I really enjoy about the Hellraiser movies, it's probably like how unique it is to everything else. Hellraiser oftentimes gets lumped into these other 80s slasher films in those franchises. And that's obviously not really quite what Hellraiser is as far as being a slasher film. Yeah, certainly Hellraiser 3 leans into that a little bit, and even Hellraiser Hell World has those elements. But by and large, Hellraiser is really kind of a combination of several different genres. It does have slasher elements to it, but it's also has that supernatural horror. I would say, even particularly with the first couple films, very gothic feeling and looking. You have psychological horror thrown in, and then of course there's the body horror, and then there's just the overall depravity and dirtiness of the films, kind of. So that's one thing I really like. I think like the themes and mythology and the atmosphere of the movies, even the later movies that aren't so good, still kind of maintain that type of atmosphere that the first two movies anyway established. It has a very disturbing nature when you watch those films where things just feel off, but in a good way as it relates to horror. And even like I said, the later some of the later sequels do try to maintain that a little bit, despite being very low budget. Um, of course, the mythology of the movies that you have this box that you basically can open a portal to hell and summon demons. It's also about exploration, those who really want the box and desire what it opens, they're looking for the ultimate pleasures and pain of hell. Essentially, they're willing to go, push the limits, as Frank would say in the first film. And so that whole thing, having this box that opens up, because it's not like Pinhead and the Cenobites are coming to you and like stalking you one at a time. You have to come to them. Essentially, you have to open that doorway for them to come to you instead. So it's kind of like a different dynamic a little bit. And then there's like the themes. I think some of the themes of Hellraiser is really about humans, what happens when we let our desires and let our, oh, what do I want to say? Yeah, our desires for the most part get the best of us. When we open Pandora's box, so to speak, the Cenobites really aren't the villains or the monsters, though sometimes they are, but um, they're basically there to judge us. They're just there because you've opened the box. These are the rules, so now you have to come with them and experience what what they think you want, which is pain and pleasure. And they're really, for the most part, I think the symbiotes represent basically the consequences of our own actions, for sure. And oftentimes in these movies, it's really the real monsters end up being some of the human characters. We, of course, see that with Frank and Julie in the first film. We see that with Dr. Chenard in the second. And even like in the third film, the character of J.P. Monroe. In the fourth film, not so much in the fourth film, maybe you could say, know, Duke DeLille, who summons the first demon, Angelique. You do get a little bit of that too in the later sequels, but that's that's another thing I really love about the series is those themes, the mythology, how unique it is. There's was never quite anything quite like it when Hellraiser came out, and nothing really like it since, for the most part. Um, but another thing too, and here's something. I'll list a couple of things that I don't like about the series, and one of it is when they in the 2000s when Hellraiser became a direct to video franchise. After the fourth film did not do particularly well in the theaters, which is a shame because it's my third favorite of the franchise. But so the Weinsteins and this decided to just go straight to video, and a lot of these movies did not feel like a Hellraiser movie, and that's because they really weren't. Instead, what it was is they would take scripts that hadn't been made into movies yet, often like suspense thrillers, probably patterned off of movies like Seven, for example, and just simply copy and pasted Pinhead uh, in the puzzle box into it and called it a Hellraiser movie. Just made a few changes to the script, and voila, we get a crappy direct to video movie. And some of those movies have some good moments to them, but oftentimes you don't even see Pinhead to the final 5 minutes of these movies, and that's just because they did shoehorn him in at the end. Even in Hellseeker, they did bring the character Kirsty Cotton back, played by Ashley Lawrence, in which case they kind of sold us a bill of goods because when I saw it in the video store, I'm thinking, oh, great, they learned their mistakes from Inferno. We're going to bring back, make a real Hellraiser movie. Instead, she's in it for all but 10 minutes in the movie, and Pinhead's in it for about seven, and that's really what you get. Instead, you end up following, and I'll touch on this more, just an unlikable character throughout the movie, and it's not at all interesting at all. So most of those movies just aren't very good. Um, they have some their moments, like I said, but they're just not good Hellraiser films for the most part. And don't even get us started on Revelations. That's a movie that's just a total dumpster fire. And that leads into another thing I don't like about the Hellraiser series, the fact that the Weinsteins got a hold of it and they basically did their best to almost tarnish the whole legacy of Hellraiser to begin with by doing what they did. It certainly, I think, cheapened the series for the most part. Fortunately, those earlier movies are so damn good. I don't think it really hurts them. And I think in retrospect, people have chosen to ignore the really bad movies and focus on the good ones, which you kind of have to do with any series that has that many movies. Not all of them are going to be good anyway. Uh, you know, I always said that Friday the 13th is probably the most consistent series because even the worst Friday the 13th movie is a lot better than other films and other franchises, I think. But with Hellraiser, yeah, and they often, I mean, Doug Bradley's talked about it at length about during this era, they would always threaten to fire him or not bring him back to play Pinhead, even though he's easily the best part of those movies. Uh, it's just the way they kind of trash the series. And of course, they're not the most, let's face it, I mean, they're pieces of shit, especially Harvey Weinstein. I'm glad he got what he deserved. I'd love to take a baseball bat to both of them, really, for what they did to Hellraiser and other franchises as well. They kind of messed around with Halloween as well. So, but getting back to it, yeah, that's one thing I don't like. That whole era, the direct to video, the fact that Weinstein's got their greasy hands on the series, and fortunately, it's no longer in their hands. As you know, one of them's in jail, and I think whole Dimension Films, that they company that they ran, pretty much went belly up after all of that went down. But getting back to some of the other things that I do like about Hellraiser are your point of view characters, your protagonist, your final girl. One thing that every franchise needs is that signature final person. Halloween has Laurie Strode and Dr. Loomis. Friday the 13th has Tommy Jarvis and a whole host of other great final people, most of them final girls. You know, Nightmare on Elm Street has Nancy Thompson, and so on. And of course, Hellraiser has their established signature final girl. That would be Kirsty Cotton, who's a great character and one of my probably my favorite, and a lot of other people as well. Very underrated, but I think in the recent years, kind of getting the recognition as the series has as a whole. But you also have other good ones too. The character of Joey, played by Terry Farrell in Hellraiser 3, is a really good final girl, a really strong protagonist. In Hellraiser 4 Bloodline, need to take a drink. With Hellraiser Bloodline, you basically have, well, same actor playing three different protagonists as you're following the bloodline of the toy maker, Philip Lemarchant, who created the first box that was used, unbeknownst to him, to summon the first demon. And of course, you followed him in the period piece in the late 1700s France. In 1990s, you get his ancestor John Merchant, or descendant John Merchant, and then in the future, of course, you get Paul Merchant. Now, the first two end up dying at the end of each of those acts, while Paul Merchant lives and defeats Pinhead and the Cenobites, and what's considered kind of a wonky section of the movie when it's outer space. But nonetheless, the actor who plays him, Bruce Ramsey, does a really good job. Um, Another one that I liked is, even though Hellraiser Deader, which is the seventh movie made, um, one of the direct-to-video sequels, but I did really like the character of Amy, played by actress Carrie Werr. That character I really liked. I wish she could have been in a better movie. Unfortunately, I would have liked to have seen her maybe in Hellraiser Judgment, or even in the reboot. Seeing that character there would have been really good. But she certainly carries the film. It's one of those movies that I will rewatch or revisit ever so often. That being said, now there's also a lot of point of view characters or protagonists that are very good, and this goes to one of the things I don't like necessarily about some of the Hellraiser movies. With Inferno, and I don't remember the character's names, not even important. You really don't even have a protagonist in that movie. You're just following this dirty cop for the most part, uh, who's unlikable, was a real piece of shit, which was probably part of which was the point. I get it, but you don't care about him or what happens to him for the most part, and you don't really have a protagonist in that story to kind of counterbalance. You know, obviously in the first Hellraiser, Frank and Julia being the main monsters, the main antagonist of that story, you still had Kirsty and Larry to kind of balance that out a little bit, as you did in some of the other movies, and didn't really have that there with Inferno. Hellseeker does the exact same thing. Once again, as Inferno. We're going to follow this unlikable character for 80 minutes or whatever. And then in the last 5 minutes, Pinhead pops out and basically gives you a rundown what it is you just watched, because it's a bunch of mind fucks going on, nothing making sense for the most part, and then having to explain what exactly happened. Like I said, in Hellseeker, you do have Kirsty in it for a little bit, and she does play an important part in that movie, but it's like almost too little, too late. And then some of the other movies are just very generic characters. Um, with Hellraiser 20, with Hellraiser Judgment, the characters were okay, uh, but nothing special. For fairly forgettable though they could have been better. I think if had they had more of a budget to work with on that movie. With the reboot, the character of Riley, who's kind of like the main protagonist, she's not awful, just not great, just okay. Just okay, as most of some of the other characters in that movie are. But so it's kind of hit and miss, but Hellraiser, at least through the earlier movies, did have a good group of protagonists that you could get behind and you could root for and could relate to, which is, I think, is important with a horror film. You don't always have to have that in horror films. There are certain movies, I think, that can be the exception, but some of the later Hellraiser sequels aren't good exceptions, to say the least. Uh, that being said, too, Hellraiser also has terrific villains. And I'm not just talking about the Cenobites, but some of the human villains. I mentioned Frank and Julia in the first film. Obviously, they both come back for part two, and you have Dr. Chenard, you have JP in part three. In the reboot, you have the character of Voight, who's probably the best human character in that whole film. These are people that, as I alluded to before, they really they kind of like give you an example of what happens when humans decide to forego throw all caution to wind off to the side and just strictly go off what it is that they desire, what that happens to be, whether it's sexual, some sort of sexual power they want, financial power, just power in general. And so they're all great examples of that. I'd often would say that Julia, I think it's one of the best, at least the top three, top four best female villains in horror. And I think a lot of people would agree because she is really vicious, especially by the time you get towards about the last half of Hellraiser, and definitely all through Hellraiser 2. So that's another great thing is are the villains in the series. So another thing that I really like too about Hellraiser, and this kind of comes to what most people love, is of course the Cenobites and their designs. They're just something that we never saw before. Obviously, the earlier movies up until the reboot were all very much Clive Barker was very much influenced by S&M clubs and so forth. That's how he kind of visualized the design of the Cenobites. These are the most grotesque yet elegant beings you can see in a horror film, and particularly Pinhead with the pins. And Pinhead would not have been as iconic of a character if not for Doug Bradley. And we'll get a little bit more about Doug Bradley later on too, as we're discussing. I am looking so far, see what's up in the chat. So another thing too that I guess once again, another thing that probably don't like about Hellraiser is probably too many sequels. They really could have stopped. Some people say they could have stopped after the first two. I would say definitely after the fourth film, they could have just stopped making sequels. And those first four movies would have made for a terrific quadrilogy that almost rivals maybe the first four movies of, say, Friday the 13th, for example. So that's just one thing. But you could say that for any franchise. Like at some point, maybe you just need to stop and wait about 15, 20 years and maybe then do a remake or reboot. So they could have just made the first four, not made a single movie up until the 2022 reboot. So that'd be like another little pet peeve, probably a minor annoyance, but for the most part, getting back to some of the other things I really love about Hellraiser is obviously the makeup and the special effects. Even in the bad movies, the practical effects are done really well. Going back to that first movie, just Frank's resurrection scene, the scene of him being torn apart at the very end, the infamous Jesus wept scene, the makeup used, obviously the blood, the gore, the scene in part two where you have that mental patient just cutting himself with a straight razor blade because he thinks he has maggots all over him. Uh, just fantastic practical effects, some of the best ever in movies. Uh, so that's another thing I love about the Hellraiser series. They are very gory, which I like. They don't hold back. And granted, horror movie doesn't necessarily have to be overly gory or anything like that for me to love it. Um, but it's just kind of a nice touch. And if you are going to include gore, make it go with the story. Don't just have it for the sake of having it, and make sure it looks good. Obviously, not they did use some like CGI a little bit in the reboot, but not enough to where you notice it. I think they used mostly practical effects on that. So that's another thing that I love about the Hellraiser series. I guess one more thing that maybe I don't like, maybe, and it's just a minor thing, is sometimes the mythology gets a little bit inconsistent regarding who gets taken to hell and tortured by opening the box and who does not. In the first film, we established if you open the box, you're pretty much going to hell. In the second one, there's a scene where Tiffany opens the box as she's kind of coerced to do it by Shenard and Julia, and the pinhead and the Cenobites leave her alone. As the famous line goes, it's not hands that call us, it's desire. So now are they saying that you have to have the desire to open the box to, I guess, taste the pleasures and pain of hell? And then it changes a little bit throughout the series, and that's nothing new for any franchise. They oftentimes, in trying to build the world, they oftentimes find themselves changing some of the mythology and some of the rules of the franchise. So once again, that's kind of a minor thing, really, but that's like one last thing that I have. And finally, I think the last thing I would say, one of my favorite parts of Hellraiser, and I talked about him earlier, is Doug Bradley as Pinhead. I don't think another actor would have done as good of a job playing that character. He really kind of fell into that character by accident. He was given one or two options: either play one of the two moving people that were moving the furniture in the house in the first Hellraiser, or he could play this thing that didn't even have a name. It was just known as the lead Cenobite. Later on in some of the later novels, Clive Barker would refer to him as the Hell Priest, which in a way I kind of like that name better. But through the movies, whether they were good or bad, Doug Bradley always kept us watching. Like I said, even in the bad movies, he's great. It's just a shame he wasn't treated better. Uh, Wish the character had been treated better through some of those movies by making an actual good Hellraiser film in those later sequels, putting some money into it and so forth. But yeah, and some of the lines by Pinhead are so iconic. Of course, we have such sights to show you. Um, will tear your soul apart. Angels to or demons to some, angels to others. Uh, your suffering will be legendary even in hell. One of my favorites from Bloodline, where the character of John Merchant says something like, "Well, for God's sakes," and Pinhead retorts back to him, "Do I look like someone who cares what God thinks?" Love that line. So a lot of great lines, great character. It's the icon and the face of the series, and rightfully so. Even if he wasn't meant to be the main face of the franchise, he still delivered and became that. And it was really the fans who kind of made him the icon of that franchise and gave him his name, essentially. Uh, so that's really kind of like it right there. I'd be curious to hear your thoughts on what you love about the Hellraiser franchise. I'll probably do another one of these once a month. Maybe I'll change the night. Doesn't look like we're getting too many views tonight, but who knows? Maybe I'll just change it back and do these on Saturday nights when I'm not doing the horror hangouts videos, or maybe I'll do a Friday evening. Kind of depends on my schedule. But yeah, comment below. Please like, share, and subscribe. And we'll see you. I think the next episode, I'm going to compare the movie Hellraiser Bloodline with the original screenplay written by Peter Atkins, which I did purchase, which was released as a book, and kind of compare and see how much better Hellraiser Bloodline could have been had we not had the studio not gotten involved. If there's anyone in the chat, say hello. How are you doing? Well, they just keep on leaving there. Guess they're timid. But anyhow, till next time, we will see you on that next episode. We'll be having another Horror Hangouts episode on September 6th. It should be a fun episode. And hopefully I'll have audio problems taken care of. But until then, we will see you next time. And thanks for tuning in and see ya.